Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is May Sadeni, and I am the Executive Director of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Syria and Syrian Refugees, from EU Migration Policies to Israel's War on Lebanon. Since Israel's September escalation in Lebanon, over 1.5 million people have been displaced from their homes. Among them, over 510,000 people have fled to Syria, with approximately 71% of them being Syrian nationals who had sought refuge in Lebanon in the years following Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's brutal crackdown on the 2011 Syrian uprisings. At least 26 Syrian returnees have been arrested by the Assad regime while attempting to return as part of this latest wave following Israel's war on Lebanon. Others have had to take perilous journeys to travel to areas of the country not controlled by the regime that continue to be bombarded. Meanwhile, and amid the rise of populist governments and rhetoric in Europe, several EU countries are considering significant changes in their policies toward Syria and Syrian refugees within their borders. Despite consistent expert and civil society reporting that Syria remains unsafe and clear international legal stipulations on non-refoulement, these countries are discussing mass deportations and further normalization of the Syrian regime to coordinate on migration. At today's event, we're privileged to be joined with an all-star panel. I'd like to introduce them one by one. First, we have Hayat Hayat, who's a columnist and consulting research fellow with Chatham House's Middle East and North Africa program. Then we have Veronica Bellintani, head of the International Law Support Unit at the Syrian Legal Development Program. And last but not least, my colleague Nadine Khishan, who is a legal associate at TIMEP, as well as an international criminal and human rights lawyer who's been working on these issues. Today's conversation is live streamed and recorded, so you can catch it on our YouTube page. And for those of us joining via Zoom, we do invite you to submit questions throughout the event during the Q&A. We'll start with 2 rounds of moderated questions, and then we will make time for those audience questions and comments. So please do send them in. We'd love to get to them. Nadine, I'd like to start with you. Can you please paint a picture for us of what the situation for Syrian refugees was in Lebanon before this war? And can you then please tell us what the context has been since the war began? How have Syrian refugees been affected by the war, and what have they experienced with regards to displacement, access to shelter, and other issues?
Yeah, thanks, May. So already over the past several years, the situation for Syrian refugees residing in Lebanon has been steadily deteriorating, along with basically the situation in the country, which has experienced multiple crises, one after the other. And I think this has been especially the case since 2019, when the country began experiencing its financial collapse, one that the World Bank called one of the worst financial and economic crises since the mid-19th century. And this was quickly followed by the COVID pandemic, which really put a strain on the entire healthcare sector and deteriorated the situation further. And then followed by the August 4th explosion, which, on top of being one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in modern history, was also very re-traumatizing for Syrian refugee populations who had fled war, only to then, for many who were residing in Beirut, to have to experience this explosion in which also many Syrian refugees died. So this was also very re-traumatizing. And with that decline in the country over time, we also saw a rise in intercommunal tensions. So we saw the Lebanese host community becoming more resentful towards the Syrian refugee population. And this was really amplified and stoked by the political class in Lebanon, which really has had a tendency of scapegoating minorities and particularly refugees for the problems of the country. This was especially stark. It became very, very stark and very violent and scary 2 years ago in 2023, when the army began forcibly deporting Syrian refugees en masse. So actually that year, ultimately, UNHCR documented almost 14,000 deportations took place over the course of that year. And it was really a big shock, honestly, for those of us who work in the refugee space, because we'd never seen the army take up these type of deportation actions, which are usually under the jurisdiction of general security. And so suddenly you had the army going into different neighborhoods, conducting raids and uh, requiring to see refugees' legal documentation. UNHCR registration certificates were not even accepted. You had to have local legal documentation in order to be safe, basically. So a lot of people were returned. It was a very dangerous situation, but luckily at that point, the global community intervened and stopped these deportations from continuing. But in 2024, we then saw again a heightened and really it seemed like a coordinated scapegoating campaign by the political class, and really also taken up by the traditional media in Lebanon, which is usually politically owned or affiliated. And so you had all kinds of statements being made, misinformation being spread about refugees, from the amount of aid that they managed to procure from humanitarian organizations, to the depletion of resources in the country, to being blamed for all of the crime that was taking place in the country, including the murder of a Lebanese politician. And so this buildup of tensions, while we didn't see sort of the concerted deportation campaign that we saw the previous year, it did result in basically a type of vigilante group going around to different parts of Lebanon and announcing on loudspeakers that Syrian refugees have to leave certain areas, otherwise there's going to be consequences, threatening them. Even school children were threatened and told that they're not allowed to return to Lebanese schools. So it was a very, you know, racist and violent time, even if it wasn't necessarily being conducted by the state. And then there also were several high risk deportations that year, actually. So while we didn't have the mass deportation campaign, we did have individuals being deported who were members of opposition groups, who were journalists, activists, who had spoken out against the regime and therefore faced a huge risk of persecution upon return. So we did have, in fact, cases of refoulement in that year. So, as a result of this entire situation, we already had many refugees opting to return because of push factors. So not because of their own true voluntary uh, want and desire to return, but because of the harassment and discrimination that they were already facing in Lebanon, and the fears and the violence that were increasingly rising. So people were not feeling that they were in a safe place to begin with. And then you had the war with Israel begin, which for most of the first year was confined mostly to the border. But over the last couple of months, we've had over a quarter of the country now under evacuation orders, and it's a very small country. So you have 1.2 million people internally displaced, all trying to access the same limited shelters and in different parts of the country. And while the state has been saying that they're providing shelter to everyone equally, regardless of nationality or religion, we have heard stories of Syrian refugee families being kicked out of shelters, and not only Syrian refugees, also migrant worker populations being kicked out of shelters to make way for Lebanese displaced. So there's clearly not enough of a coordinated effort to care for all the populations that are displaced, not to mention the tensions that could exist between certain communities and how that's not being looked after or addressed either. And then we've also had over 500,000 people cross from Lebanon to Syria over the past few months, with 70% of them being Syrian nationals. And already the Syrian Network for Human Rights has documented 26 cases of Syrians being arrested upon re-entry to Syria, including one case of someone who has already been killed under torture. So another clear case of refoulement. And even if we think that this is maybe a small number compared to the numbers of people who are crossing, we shouldn't at all take this as, a factual representation of the actual numbers that are of people that are being arrested or persecuted or facing risks in Syria. We've also heard that sometimes the regime waits months before they arrest someone. So we could be under the impression that someone has returned safely and is not under threat, and in fact, they still are. So yeah, we can't assume that the number of documented cases are representative of the whole, and that in itself, I think, should terrify us, especially that there's already been documented cases of torture and murder. So, even if many refugees don't face the threat of, specific persecution upon return to Syria, they still don't necessarily know what they're returning to and whether or not it's safe for them. But on top of that, the situation in Syria is actually becoming more violent over the past year. There's been an escalation in violence between certain groups, with war crimes being committed on all sides. And the UN Commission has recently warned that there's the possibility of actually a large-scale war again in Syria. So, and on top of that, you have attacks by Israel in Syria that have killed civilians, and attacks by Israel in Lebanon that have killed Syrian refugees as well as Lebanese civilians. So now we're in a situation where Syria is not safe still for return, and Lebanon is also not safe as to be hosting refugees.
Thank you, Nadine, and thank you for painting an unfortunately dire picture, but it is important for us to start with that context. Veronica, I want to come, sorry, let's go to Hayed. Hayed, I want to come next to you. Building on what Nadine shared with us, how has Israel's war on Lebanon driven Syrians to return to Syria? How many have returned? What has the journey of return been like? Have they all returned to the same parts of Syria? And what should we make of these returns? How do we contextualize and understand them?
Thank you, Mai, for having me. And quickly to touch upon some of the questions you mentioned. You already mentioned that there was around 500 people who have crossed. I think that the exact number of people is still not exactly known, because you have different sources who are basically citing different numbers. But as of 2 days ago, it seems that around 560 people have crossed to Syria.
560,000.
560,000 people, yeah, sorry. Around 65 to 70% of them are believed to be Syrian. So we're talking about between 365,000 to 395,000 Syrians. Now, when it comes to the journey, I think it depends on a few factors, because it's quite difficult to basically summarize the journey of not only that amount of people, but also it happened over a couple of weeks. And the situation changed dramatically during that time as well. So if you look at the situation of those who crossed at the very beginning, let's say towards the end of September, when the fighting was taking place mostly, or at least airstrikes were mostly targeting Lebanese towns and areas, the situation was still fine in a sense that people were still able to take either public transportation or use their car in order to cross directly all the way, let's say, to Damascus or to whatever town or area they want to cross back to. However, the situation got worse later, because Israel started targeting the crossing points between Syria and Lebanon. So physically, it's not now possible for people to just use cars to cross. Most of them, as I don't know if you have seen videos, they are basically, because of the damage caused to the infrastructure, especially at the crossings, they have now to basically reach the end of the sort of accessible route, and then carry bags and all of that to the other side, and then try to secure either another mean of transportation, or rely on whatever the UN agencies are providing there. But then you have also people who don't feel safe to cross back to Syria. So many of those, at least male Syrian refugees, cross back illegally to Syria. Then the difficulties there are different in terms of exploitation, in terms of the risks facing them. So this is in general, I think those are the two factors that determine that the journey of those who return to regime control areas. As you alluded in your question, I think the destination is not everyone's going to or staying in regime control areas. People are also trying to cross to other areas, and for those who are not familiar with the basically territorial sort of control in Syria, Syria is divided into three main regions. One of them, and the majority of the country, is under the control of the Syrian regime, but then you have two others sort of regions controlled by Kurdish-led forces in northeast Syria, and then various opposition groups in northwest Syria. So you have people trying to cross to both northeast and northwest. The challenges there are not only related to the challenges that are sort of imposed by the regime, whether the risks that they face when they cross, or the sort of exploitation, having to pay bribes and all of that in order to be able to easily make it to their final destination, but also there were many challenges imposed on them by the de facto authorities in those areas. Even if they are from those areas, they still have to basically go through a long process of basically securing a sponsor there, and then proving who they are, why they are going there, and all of that, which basically adds to the suffering and difficulties they are facing. In general, the numbers are not quite clear. The figures I have around, I think, 20,000 people, 21,000 people crossed to northeast Syria, which is closer and easier to access from region controlled areas, and around 10,000 people made it all the way to northwest Syria after crossing via northeast Syria. But in general, it's a long journey. It's very expensive because you have to pay different de facto actors and then cross different checkpoints. Now, what do we make of this? I think a few quick remarks. One of them is that despite the challenges that Syrians face in Lebanon before the war that Israel imposed on Lebanon, many people did not cross back to Syria. And we have seen that not only in figures, but also in the different attempts that and initiatives led by mostly the general security, as well as other sort of institutions within the Lebanese government to facilitate the voluntary return of Syrians back to Syria. But the majority did not go back to Syria for many reasons, mostly because the roots of the basically problem that pushed them out are still there and still valid. Now we're talking about numbers. So we're talking about around 400,000 people going back there, not out of choice, but they are now basically facing two tough situations and two difficult sort of choices: either stay there and risk being killed in an airstrike or whatever fighting happening there, or going back and facing sort of the same fears and concerns that push you in the first place. And many are basically saying, maybe it will be not safe for me, but at least will be safe for my family. So either they will risk their own life in order to provide some sort of protection for their family, or they will stay and they send their families back to Syria. And I think the second issue, which also was mentioned by Nadine, is that there's no clear mechanism to monitor the return of those refugees. Most importantly, provide them with protection. So we know of 26 people who have been detained. One of them was even killed in detention facility, but those are not accurate figures because we don't have real sort of verifiable and independent mechanisms in order to do so. And the last one that I want to end with is that the number here is not really the major issue that we need to keep in mind, because even if you report 5 cases where incidents were violations committed against people, and then the risk is high, that will be enough for thousands and millions of Syrians who live outside not to go back to Syria. So keeping that in mind, the number here is not important as long as the act itself is being repeated and is being unpredictable. So anyone could be threatened and at some point maybe even face similar destination or fate. So I'll end here. I'll be happy to continue discussion later.
Thank you, Hayat. And thank you actually for grounding us in this reality, both in the reality of what people experience, that the numbers don't tell the whole story, but you also touch on, and I believe our colleagues will touch on this as well, under international law, it's not a matter of numbers. It's much more complex and dynamic than that. And the fact that there are these in the first place would lead us to believe, and to believe what many have said time and time again, that Syria is unsafe. In fact, very recently, the European Court issued a decision saying that even if parts of Syria are safe and others remain unsafe, the whole of the country remains unsafe. And so it's critical for us, I think, to ground ourselves as we continue the conversation. Veronica, now I'm going to come to you, and I want to ask you, can you tell us what the situation is like for Syrians once they make it back to Syria? What risks and realities do returnees face? We heard our colleagues talk a bit about immediately when they go back, but what is life like in Syria? Why do experts and civil society organizations continue to argue that Syria as a whole is not safe?
Thank you so much, May, for inviting me and for organizing such an important event on this topic right now. So my colleague Nadine and Haid has already mentioned quite a lot of very important points, and I want to re-emphasize a key remark made by Haid and Nadine earlier, which is that Syrians returning to Syria at the moment should not be seen as testament that Syria is safe. On the contrary, it instead is a proof that the international community has failed to provide Syrian refugees with any legal and effective and concrete pathways for protection and accountability in the past decade. So what kind of reality do Syrians face? So as Haidas mentioned, what Syrians face is proof of the fact that the Syrian regime has been completely lacking any sort of interest or commitment to human rights in the past 13 years, because what Syrians face when they return to the country right now are violations that are identical to the ones that they fled from. So they face torture, they face political persecution, enforced appearance, sexual abuse, and arrest. They face military conscription, which is also making a lot of people trying to flee and then being arrested or even murdered at checkpoints, as we have noticed. They also face challenges in getting back access to their properties or to their lands. And we've seen one specific case of an individual and being murdered by Hezbollah when he tried to go back to his house when returning back from Lebanon. So I think it is clear here to argue that what Syrians face when they return back to the country is the same root causes that they try to flee from. They go back to a country where perpetrators of the same abuses have remained in power, where the same political and institutional framework and system that is enabling and perpetuating these crimes remain intact, and when there is absolutely no sense of accountability, of rule of law, or legal guarantees can protect those people from ever remedying the abuses that they're being subjected to or to be protected. And as Haid has mentioned, there is no legal guarantees, and even assuming that the UNHCR can actually hold this role in Syria or the ICRC, we've seen in the past how those bodies as well are really much engaging or directly cooperating with the Syrian regime. So there is no independent monitoring system that can help Syrian refugees from being arrested or tortured or deprived of liberty in many different forms, and from making sure that they can be released. So in this context, as you say, as Syrian civil society, there have been constantly calls for considering Syria unsafe. And those calls have been reiterated by international organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International in the past, by the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations, and by the UN Commission on Syria of the Human Rights Council, that has constantly in the past years submitted reports to the Human Rights Council about how torture and arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance are ongoing practices by the Syrian regime. And as both Nadine and Haid has mentioned, those acts and those acts of torture, those cases of detention are continuing right now, specifically during the Israeli aggression on Lebanon, with cases of people being arrested and an individual actually being killed under torture. So those cases are persisting. They are persisting despite the continuous condemnation by international bodies. And they persist specifically within the context of a binding order by the International Court of Justice, which has been issued exactly 1 year ago. And I think that this case really gives you an idea about how the Syrian regime doesn't have any interest in addressing the ongoing torture and its practices of detention. As I think we may all know, the Netherlands and Canada brought forward a case to determine the state responsibility of Syria under the Convention Against Torture. And 1 year ago, we had an order that should have pushed the Syrian regime to prevent torture, to make sure that its officials do not commit torture. Now, this has not happened. We've seen very recently a report, the Syrian Network for Human Rights, which has reported that at least 1,161 individuals have been arrested since the issuance of this order, and more than 84 individuals must have died under torture. And as Haid has mentioned, those are just the numbers that we are aware of, and it could be even much greater than those. So if we think that in 1 year, despite a binding order that has been welcomed by all international community, that has been reinforced by the Commission of Inquiry, that has been reinforced by the Special Rapporteur on Torture, by the Human Rights Committee, the Syrian regime has nevertheless arrested people and killed them under torture. We have an idea about the kind of gravity and severity of the violation that Syrian refugees can face when they return back to the country. And what I think it is very important to focus on when it comes to this kind of order is that the order clearly says that Syrians and Syrian refugees especially, they face irreparable harm in Syria because of the systemic and widespread form of torture the Syrian regime is committing without any sort of checks and balances. So the concept of irreparable harm, which is a legal concept, is actually very straightforward. If you are going back to Syria right now with the lack of accountability, with lack of protectional guarantees, with lack of any sort of check and balances on the action of the Mukhabarat or the Shabiha or any other type of militias affiliated with the Syrian regime, you are most likely to be arrested and tortured and maybe also die in detention. And those violations are not only limited to individuals that the Syrian regime perceives to be opposed. We have seen in the past reports by organizations such as the Association of Detainees and Missing of Sednaya that now the detention system and the detention apparatus in the Syrian context by the Syrian regime is a system that lives upon extortion and corruption and bribing. So even if you maybe are not a political opponent, you could still be arrested and face the same kind of violations of arbitrary detention and torture and disappearance just because certain Mukhabarat officials or certain militias wants to gain something out of this detention. So it really goes, as Nadine has mentioned, it touches upon the principle of non-refoulement. It touches upon the ongoing and systematic and widespread use of torture, but it also, these type of violations are so ingrained in the way that the Syrian regime exists and operates and survives that even if you're not a political opponent to the Syrian regime, at the moment, you could still be at risk of being detained and tortured and disappeared. And this is a concept that I think the international community still needs to understand and to see really, as you say, that when we're looking at the Syrian context and the Syrian country as a whole, the whole country is unsafe, and being, an ordinary Syrian doesn't make you safe from torture and disappearance because the Syrian regime does not operate in this manner. So I think it's very important to see the whole picture and not only cases, as Nadine mentioned, that could be cases of non-refoulement, because every single Syrian could be at risk of those violations moving forward.
Thank you, Veronica, for explaining that and also taking us outside of the political context. I think often people think of just the risk to public dissidents or opponents, and as you establish, it's a much larger story. I'm going to jump into a second round of moderated questions, and just a reminder to our audience that after this round, we will be turning to your questions, so please do keep submitting them and engaging with us. Nadine, I'd like to come to you. While this war is happening, and increasingly we're seeing the EU, which is home to many Syrian refugees, change their tone on Syria. A number of EU countries are becoming much less welcoming in their policies, practices, and rhetoric towards refugees at large, and Syrian refugees in particular. Can you highlight some of the key trends of what we're seeing affect Syrian refugees in Europe, from Europe?
Yeah, thanks, May. So I think what we're seeing really globally is sort of a shift towards more right-wing policies, whether like in all of the West, whether we're talking about the US or European countries. And, you know, obviously with these kinds of attitudes, right-wing politics and opinions, it's very anti-refugee. And so there has been for many years now, and even as political parties in Europe that are more left-leaning have been trying to compete with these more right-wing agendas, they've had to sort of come more to the center with their policies on refugees, and therefore this is ultimately means a reduction in the rights and protections that refugees are afforded. I think there are two main trends that the EU and global North kind of seem to be heading towards when it comes to Syria. And hopefully these can be stopped, honestly, but seems to be their leanings at the moment. The first one is declaring parts of Syria safe for return, and the second one being some level of normalization with the Syrian regime. And for the first part about declaring parts of Syria safe for return, this was already spearheaded a few years ago by Denmark, where they declared Damascus safe. And actually removed the temporary protected status from many Syrians that were residing in Denmark. But because Denmark doesn't have diplomatic relations with Syria, they couldn't actually return Syrians there. So, and through the appeal processes that are available in Denmark, many were actually able to appeal and get a stronger refugee protection than what they previously had. But there's still a segment of the population that is now basically in a state of limbo, where they're neither fully legal in Denmark, nor can they be returned to Syria. So, and initially, this actually inspired a research project that I'm part of, which looks exactly at that, at the return policies that the EU is eyeing around Syria, and how those policies then impact countries of the global south like Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. So this this shift in policy by Denmark was what inspired that research. And initially what we were seeing is that most other EU nations were having a very strong opposition to this policy shift. And rejecting it wholeheartedly and saying that we're not going to be declaring Syria safe. We follow the UNHCR line on this, et cetera, et cetera. But there has definitely been a shift in that tone, especially as countries around the Mediterranean, like Cyprus, Italy, and Greece, have been more and more pushing for the return basically of Syrian refugees. And even beyond that, I would say the EU and other, Western powers have not really engaged in a true burden sharing with refugee hosting countries since the beginning of the crisis. I mean, less than 1% of Syrian refugees in Lebanon have been resettled to other countries. So that's just a shameful number. And on top of that, you have these countries consistently engaging in pushbacks at land and sea borders that are very violent and that risk the lives of asylum seekers and migrants. Not only risk the lives, but have actually resulted in the deaths of many asylum seekers and migrants who've tried to come to different coasts and been pushed back by the Coast Guard or by Frontex, and then had their ships capsized or been pushed back at land borders into no man's lands. where they starved or froze to death. So we're talking about something extremely violent. And it's really kind of shocking to think about, the reaction that these Western powers would often have towards countries like, Lebanon or Turkey when they're forcibly returning Syrian refugees, but not, they don't have the same reaction to their own practices, which are extremely violative of human rights and the international rule-based order, basically. So you've had these mass violations of the right to life, the right to seek asylum, and basically violations of the principle of non-refoulement. So, and on top of that, I think the second piece of that, the reason why they want to push towards normalization with Syria, or some level of normalization, is we've heard many policymakers say, oh, well, we think refugees are staying in X and X country because they need the humanitarian aid. So if we provided aid in Syria, then they would be able to return. But again, then you're ignoring, as Veronica and Haid were pointing out, the entire context of Syria, which is that Syria is not safe for returns, and that people are being arrested and tortured and killed still to this day. So yeah, and the thing is that global countries of the global south are very much aware of what Europe and other powers are doing. And so even in the first year of our research in 2023, before the war with Israel began, we were already hearing from diplomats and officials that EU policy clearly shows that the EU does not want Syrian refugees to make their way to their countries. So then why are they putting this kind of pressure on countries like Lebanon, etc., that have so many problems and that are so strained already economically? So you were already hearing this kind of rhetoric already in 2023 about the double standards that global South countries were observing. And we were hearing this both from, Western officials and regional officials. So it was a narrative that was clearly going around. And then on top of it now, with over a year of the plausible genocide that's taking place in Gaza, now there's even more reluctance by global South countries to really listen to anything that the global North has to say. It's really like stark that basically the double standards and the unequal application of the law. And so people are really turning away from this in general. And now it's becoming more of a, refugees are being used as a bargaining chip, basically, where, countries of the global south will say, well, we know that you don't want these refugees to make their way to your countries, so you need to provide us with the funding to support them. And so what you end up having, just recently, the EU made deals with Tunisia, Egypt, and Lebanon, where it's providing, quite a sum of money, assuming that it's meant to take care of migration issues. But really, a lot of this funding is actually going to the very apparatuses that are violating the rights of refugees and placing them at higher risk in the countries that they reside in. So we kind of frame this in our research as a race to the bottom, where basically more and more states are just trying to evade their international legal obligations. And I think unless there's really a push from everyone, from the global community, to return to a rule-based order and to return to international standards, it's just going to continue deteriorating. The situation will just continue deteriorating. And as I mentioned, now with the expanded conflict in Lebanon, I mean, it's absurd to me that someone should flee war in their country only to die in war in their country of refuge, in their country of asylum. So really there needs to be some action taking place now to resettle or create temporary pathways to safety for the refugee population in Lebanon.
Thank you, Nadine, and thank you for laying out both the set of policies relevant for our conversation in the EU affecting Syrians, whether on deportation, refugee, asylum, but also on the normalization of the regime, as well as the larger global context that this all occurs in, including these EU externalization agreements, as we've heard them been called. Veronica, on that note, I want to come to you. Alongside these changing policies affecting migrants and refugees, the conversation in Europe is also changing on, like we just said, normalization of the Syrian regime. And Italy seems to be leading the charge, but it's not alone. Can you tell us more about what is happening on the normalization front, and how do we expect this to affect Syrian refugees and then Syrians around the world?
Thank you, May. This is quite of a difficult question, and I would like to start by saying that as an Italian citizen, I feel deeply ashamed of my country's decision to normalize with the Syrian regime and to lead those efforts in the first place. This move is unacceptable, it is immoral, and it is also profoundly disrespectful toward the Syrian people, their rights, and their struggle for freedom and justice, and therefore should not be seen lightly as some kind of creative diplomacy, but it should be seen as the unacceptable and immoral move that it is in practice. So, as you say, in recent months, we have seen normalization discourse quite shifting in Europe, and we also have seen those efforts take also a more coordinated approach. We've seen that in May, several interior ministers met in Cyprus from around 10 European countries to discuss the issue of Syrian refugees' return. We've then heard that in July, Italy officially announced the reopening of its embassy in Damascus, which was closed in 2012, and also the appointment of an ambassador, which is the first ambassador from the G7 to actually go back to operate with the Syrian regime at this level of diplomatic relationships. And on that same period, Italy, together with other 10 European countries, also submitted a letter to the European Union to ask for a shift and a reevaluation of the European policy on Syria. I've followed quite closely the different statements that European countries have made on this issue. They have made many different justifications for this move. Some of them argue that, and that's what actually the letter was saying, that the European Union has been stuck on a policy that it is now old, it is not anymore relevant to the reality on the ground, and therefore the European Union, according to this country, need a policy that is more realistic or pragmatic. Honestly speaking, this rationale, as we've heard before, also from Haid and Nadine, and as I mentioned earlier, it actually ignores the reality on the ground, and it is reductive. It reduces the Syrian issue to a matter of stability or to an issue of conflict, when it instead has always been a dictatorial regime that has committed and continues to commit crimes against humanity against its own people, and continues to do so through violent and non-violent means, such as also the decision to constantly enact new laws and property regulations that make the return of refugees even difficult, because they are not allowed to return to their areas or to their properties or to go back to the life that they had before being forced out of the country by the Syrian regime. It is also reductive in the sense that the Syrian regime lost its legitimacy years ago, and it is not going to be the opinion of a few far-right governments to change the opinion of Syrians in this regard. It is also quite short-sighted. A lot of countries are arguing that the conflict is over, the hostilities are not anymore at the same level that they were years ago, and so it is time now to focus on the peace. On building peace, on peace building, on this type of stabilization efforts that completely forget and completely ignore the reality of the situation on the ground. And I think those policies are short-sighted, because we all know anyone who does any kind of work on international law, on international justice, we have seen very well that any historic precedent from Latin America to Africa and to Asia always teach us that no sustainable peace is possible without justice. So for European countries to believe that engaging with the Syrian regime or to going back to collaborate with the Syrian regime as it is before 2011, it is short-sighted and it's not going to ever achieve whatever European countries want to in the Syrian context. Now, as I said, those policies are reductive, they are short-sighted, they're also unrealistic, but first and foremost, they are undermining and violating in one way or another fundamental principles of international law. So as Nadine said, there has been a lot of ongoing conversation about Syrian refugees' return and safe zones in Europe, and everything started with Denmark. But lately, we're noticing even more efforts being taken toward this direction. There is, at the moment, a conversation happening within the European Union about the possible appointment of an EU special envoy for Syria, which supposedly should focus on the issue of Syrian refugees' return. We have heard that the Czech Republic, which is one of the countries part of this group with Italy, is interested in conducting fact-finding missions in Syria to assess whether certain areas are safe for return. And Italy has allegedly met with the Syrian regime and the Mukhabarat to discuss creating possible safe zones for Syrian refugees to return to. And allegedly, plans are already underway by directly engaging with the Syrian regime on this front and actors that can help in putting together those plans. Now, to be very clear, those moves are not only immoral or unacceptable, as I mentioned earlier, but those are actually a violation of international law. Any work toward establishing safe zones in Syria, whatever the name safe or secure that the Czech Republic or Italy wants to use, they're basically going to be a violation of the principle of non-refoulement, like Nadine has mentioned earlier, but they're also going to be a violation of clear obligations under international law of European countries, which are not supposed to facilitate or to provide aid or assistance to the Syrian regime in committing torture. Europe and European countries may utilize the justification that by engaging with the UNHCR or by engaging with the ICRC, there is going to be safety and guarantees of protection for people returning to those areas, but that's not the reality on the ground, and therefore any action by European countries toward this kind of plans of creating safe zones or pushing back Syrians toward safe zones in the country is basically a violation of international law and it's a violation of the obligations under the Convention Against Torture. So I want just to finalize my point by bringing back us to the order by the International Court of Justice. So as I mentioned, the International Court of Justice did do an order against the Syrian regime to prevent and to not commit torture. But the order is not only important for what it says to the Syrian regime, it's also what it says about torture in Syria and what it says about what European countries and other countries, but I focus on European countries because, as Nadine mentioned, we do like to pretend to be the moral, the beacon of morality in the world. So when European countries face it themselves right now with this anniversary of the International Court of Justice order, that is exactly the framework that they should use when it comes to engage with the Syrian regime. It exactly tells them that at the moment in Syria, there is an irreparable harm to Syrians because of the systemic and widespread use of torture by the Syrian regime. And therefore, what doesn't mean is that the European countries should not engage in migration policies or efforts to return Syrians, because that would be in contradiction with the order, but also in contradiction with the principle of non-refoulement. They should not in any way provide aid or assistance to the Syrian regime ongoing commission of torture, which means also not only not normalizing with the Syrian regime, because diplomatic normalization and diplomatic relationships means rehabilitating the Syrian regime and means denying or dismissing ongoing crimes. But it also means that by acting and working directly with the Syrian regime, such as Italy is doing right now, or the Czech Republic may do in the future, it is actually rendering full aid and assistance to the Syrian regime in possibly committing torture moving forward. And one last point, even if normalization is already occurring, countries should use their leverage or whatever diplomatic relationships they're building now with the Syrian regime to push forward the Syrian regime to abide by its order. And I want to complete with this sentence because I do really remember when Italy announced this new reevaluation of the Syrian policy. Italy argued that they were doing so because it was time to put Syria back under the spotlight. Now, the order, it is what tells us that should be under the spotlight. This order is telling us that what is going on in Sednaya should be under the spotlight. What is happening in mass graves, where people are being constantly buried without providing any information about their whereabouts and their fate to the loved ones, that should be under the spotlight. what is happening in detention centers should be under the spotlight. So if European countries want to tell us, we want to put Syria back on the spotlight, that order is telling you, this is what you should see. This is what you should look for when you go to Syria. Surely it is not electricity that should be under the spotlight. It is torture, it is detention, it is enforced disappearance, which are humanitarian issues, which are issues that, if they remain unsolved, there is no actual solution to Syria in any way whatsoever. They're going to remain, and they're going to constantly affect whatever future of Syria we're going to look for. So this is what the spotlight should be on. If anything, the spotlight should be on the ongoing human rights abuses, on the impunity that the Syrian regime is enjoying, and on the challenges and risks that Syrian refugees, detainees, displaced people, and the Syrian people as a whole are going to face because of normalization.
Thank you, Veronica, for laying that out. And I know there is separately some interest in the situation in Syria economically and with the aid context, and we'll get to that during the Q&A. But before we do, I have one final question for Hayat, and then we're going to the many questions that our audience have submitted. Hayat, can you talk to us a bit more about Syria today amid these developments, whether the war, changing EU policies, or this returnee influx? What does the country look like? How is the government positioning itself for the period to come? And what do we think this means for the Syrian people?
Sure. I think maybe starting with how the regime is trying to position itself and benefit from the situation will be a good entry point to then see how that would impact the Syrians who live in Syria as well as those who live elsewhere as well. So the Syrian regime has been trying to benefit from the different sort of difficult situations and miseries that are taking place in the region as well as in Syria as well. So if you look at, for example, the situation we are discussing here, which is basically the result of the war on Lebanon, you will see how the regime has been trying to use that to its advantage in order to, one, say, look, we are opening the doors and we are allowing refugees back, and then capitalize on that, not only to boost its legitimacy and as well as sort of diplomatic relations with different countries, including within the EU, but also to use that as leverage in order to say, if you want more people back, then you'll have to basically pay us more money. But more importantly, or as importantly, equally important, would be to relieve the sanctions that are imposed on the regime and the different networks linked to it. So, and we have seen that. We have seen that when it comes to the regime's sort of negotiations or talks with different Arab countries as well as with EU countries. Now, I think what's important to highlight here is that those asks are mainly sort of designed to benefit the regime and its network, but it's not really benefiting or will be benefiting the people of Syria, because if we start discussing the details of that, the regime wants that money to be channeled to its institutions directly, which would give it the upper hand on basically determining how that money is being spent and who will benefit from it. If you look at how the regime has been able to manipulate aid sort of structure and support inside Syria, you'll see that the regime has systematically throughout the conflict managed to use it as a tool to reward the communities that are perceived to be loyal to Assad directly, and then punish those who are perceived to be sort of opposing him. And here we will be a continuation of the same policy. What's also important is to see that even in discussions where the regime is asking for big asks and financial asks, the regime is refusing to provide any serious concessions when it comes to guaranteeing the protection and safety of those who return, as well as those who still remain living in Syria. And again, we have seen that on different platforms, and it has been discussed by different officials who have engaged with the regime directly on that. So now, when we see this situation, the regime, the last bit I think would be important to highlight before I forget here is that this will not lead to sort of political end to the conflict. It actually will have the opposite impact, because it will undermine the political process and prospects for reaching a mutually just and accepted solution to the conflict, because the regime will have no motive to actually compromise or share power or change its behavior. So what does that basically leave what does that mean for the rest of the people who live there or elsewhere? One, that the country will remain divided, and the division here is not only related to the territorial sort of front lines that I mentioned earlier, the three main components, but you have divisions within the same areas that are controlled by the same de facto authority. So in regime control areas, you have division between those who were against the regime before and then those who opposed the regime before, but also you see it elsewhere as well. So that division and hate sort of rhetoric and hate speech is gonna continue even among those who share now the same sort of territories. Now, then, in addition to that, the economic situation, and we will be, I think, we'll have to touch upon it later on, but the economic situation is getting worse across Syria, no matter which area you focus on. And that not only related to high inflation, low wages, but also related to lack of adequate services, which means that people have to pay from their own pockets to secure the basics like water, electricity, even to collect garbage and clean their areas. And then in addition to that, I think that the security situation will continue to get worse, mostly because the regime has no sort of real motive to change its policies, but also, as Veronica mentioned earlier, that many networks and groups are using those violations in order to generate revenues for them. And I think the situation will get worse and worse. In addition to that, you have increased criminal activities for different reasons. And then for sure, you have that this is within Syria, and then you have the attacks that will most likely continue from Israel and other groups. Those are the political security and economic situation. But I think all in all, it shows that the situation will only get worse, especially knowing that funding for not only humanitarian operations, but funding for Syria in general is decreasing year after year, despite the fact that the needs are increasing. So people will have to basically do more for less, which will not lead to any improvement. And the opposite will basically mean that people will continue to suffer for the different reasons I mentioned. I'll stop here. I will be happy to continue the discussion later.
Thank you, Hayed. And you laid out a lot there, and there are actually a number of related questions from the audience. So now with this last half an hour of the conversation, I do want to turn to those questions. What I'll do is I'll try to group questions. I'll direct them to one speaker, but to my other speakers, please feel free to unmute yourself and join in if you'd like to add anything. Nadine, I'd like to start with you. We have two questions, one from an anonymous submitter and one from Drew, and it really revolves on the role of the Lebanese government and the Lebanese authorities. To summarize, the sentiment in Lebanon towards Syrian refugees was already poor before the war, and might worsen on the other side in light of the immense stress on the country. What can we expect? are Lebanese authorities going to realistically accept hosting refugees? What can be done to avoid violence and tension? How can we mitigate some of the outcomes that also Veronica alluded to in her questioning as well?
Yeah, that's a it's a complicated question for sure. I think in general we just have had an information problem in Lebanon. Again, because of the concentrated scapegoating of refugees and the misinformation around Syrian refugees. So already you have you know, a large segment of the Lebanese population that tends to equate Syrian refugees with the Syrian regime, which, you know, has a history of, it had occupied Lebanon for several years, and many war crimes were committed during that period. And so there's a lot of resentment by the Lebanese towards the Syrian regime, and unfortunately, they don't really recognize the fact that Syrian refugees are fleeing from the same oppressor. And so there's this conflation of Syrians with the regime. And so on top of that, now with the worsening situation in the country, you do hear more and more the average Lebanese person saying, well, our country can't handle this. We're strained to the edge. We just really don't have the capacity. We don't have the space, et cetera, which, I mean, to some extent, you're talking about a country of 4 to 5 million people with a refugee population of 1.5 to 2 million, if you also consider Palestinian refugees and other populations. And many Syrian refugees in Lebanon are not even registered with UNHCR. So we don't actually know how many are present in Lebanon. So indeed, like the failures of the international community to really properly take up burden sharing have increased the burden on Lebanon, but that doesn't justify, obviously, violations of the principle of non-refoulement. This is a customary international law principle that applies to every country across the world, regardless of whether or not they've ratified the Refugee Convention. And in terms of, you know, Lebanon allowing refugees back in, I mean, it's never really happened in that way. It's not about, you know, Lebanon has not just been allowing refugees to come into the country. Mostly they've been entering irregularly through smuggling routes, and this is also very dangerous. But it's more about, yeah, you know, what can we do in the country, you know, at that point to increase tolerance between communities? And this is honestly just such a big question. I feel like there was progress being made towards diffusing intercommunal tensions when we had a lot of robust programming for refugee and impoverished Lebanese populations together. So we've heard a lot of success stories from local NGOs where they were able to bring, you know, both communities together to give trainings, to provide work opportunities, etc. And so this did, you know, increase basically mutual understanding from one side to the other, and also just constantly trying to counter these false narratives about refugees and the situation of the country and who's really responsible for it. So yeah, it's quite a big undertaking, but I think also a big piece of that is the international community really adhering to the standards that it has set for the world. And by doing so, you increase basically a form of peer pressure between countries. Like countries are influenced by peer pressure. If they see that everyone is acting in a certain way and they're the only ones diverging from that standard, there's going to be a sense of shame associated with that. So that's why there needs to be a return to international standards.
Thanks, Nadine, for that. Next, I want to group a few questions to Veronica. Veronica, there's one comment and question from Valerie Hughes, and in it, she asks if we can discuss a bit more about the urgency of resettling Syrians. She gives the example of Ireland, which has delayed for 2 years or more resettlement of a small number of Syrian refugees who've actually already had their papers. Now Irish Red Cross are appealing to the Irish public to resettle families in local communities. This might delay the process further. If you'd like to kind of weigh in on the issue of resettlement in Europe and what we're seeing. And then we also have one question from an anonymous submitter, but it's an important one. Is there any Western country, or any country for that part, that's doing the right thing concerning Syrian refugees? Is there a positive example we can cite to, or at least positive examples of practices? Because it's important to kind of look to that as well.
Thank you so much. I mean, as Nadine mentioned, I also mentioned earlier, the reason why Syrian refugees are going back to Syria right now is because they're not given any option. I mean, the option right now, or at least even a couple of years ago, was I either stay in Lebanon, or I take a boat to Cyprus, or I either stay in Turkey, where I'm facing discrimination and possibility of deportation, or I take a boat to Greece, where I'm most likely going to be detained and face ill treatment, or I go by land and then end up in Bulgaria, where I'm going to be arbitrarily deprived of my liberty for quite months or even years. So Syrian refugees have always been given the option of either a very bad living condition in the areas of where they have asked for asylum in the first place, whether it is Turkey or Lebanon or Jordan, or the sea as a second option. So at the moment, we found themselves in a situation which is even worse, where Syrian refugees in Lebanon, they don't even have any more access to the sea. They have only access to the Syrian regime, where they have, the perpetrator of the abuses they fled from. So the issue of refugees resettlement has been an issue that has been brought up by Syrian society for so long. The lack of any sort of legal or effective pathways for protection is something that Syrian society has addressed in many different instances during the period of the deportation that Nadine mentioned in 2023 in Lebanon, but also during the constant different phases of deportation that Syrian refugees have been facing in Turkey. So there is an obvious need for urgent resettlement, but that is within the context we're facing now of normalization of discourse, in which European countries do not want refugees in their own countries, and they do not want refugees to ever arrive to Europe through land or through sea because of their externalization of border agreements. I really found difficult to think that European countries are going to engage on a policy of refugees resettlement. If anything, and I'm very sorry to bring up this very pessimistic overlook, but we have to remember that, yes, at the moment, as you mentioned, May, at the beginning, there has been a European Court of Justice decision that you cannot argue that a country is safe if certain areas still, in certain areas, people may still face persecution. So you're not allowed at the moment under European regulation to argue that certain areas can be safe and return those people to those. Unfortunately, we have seen that the European Union have taken a completely different kind of approach in their own migration policy discussion in 2024. And from 2026 onwards, the European regulation will actually allow European countries to consider certain areas as safe, and therefore to allow for people to be returned countries, even if just because of those areas are safe or specific zones are safe. So obviously, this is something that may happen from 2026 onwards. There could be appeals, there could be legal challenges to this EU migration pact, but this is the way that European countries are going. Another issue that is really, it's a very pessimistic overlook, but this is really the kind of precedent and the kind of track record that Europe has at the moment. We've seen that the von der Leyen Commission in the past has not shied away from doing agreements with dictatorships in the MENA region, just for the sake of prioritizing security or refugees-related issues over the rights of individuals in those countries. We've seen deals with Lebanon, as Nadine has mentioned, with the dictator in Tunisia, with al-Sisi in Egypt, and those all go back to the 2016 migration deal with Turkey. And to be honest, when I see those kind of actions that European countries are taking around the issue of refugees return in Syria, and this whole conversation about safe zones or safe return, I I'm not going to be surprised if at one point Italy or other countries part of this coalition will argue that the European Commission should make the same deal with the Syrian regime. It is a policy that it is not so far away from reality within the context of having to respond to the crisis of refugees leaving Lebanon. It is not a policy so out of logic, given the logic in which the European Union is now dealing with the Syrian regime. So I think that I understand the value of discussing about refugees resettlement, but I think that that is now a topic that European countries will never engage on any longer. It is now about the idea of returning Syrians back to their country in whatever way it is, even if it is illegal. And this is the type of issue that we need to push all our legal and advocacy efforts, because Bashar al-Assad, unfortunately, and I wanted to make this argument before, Bashar al-Assad has benefited a lot from the tragedy of the earthquake in 2023. It benefited because it allowed for humanitarian exemptions on sanctions. It allowed a quicker shift in its relationship with certain countries and normalization happened. Now the Syrian regime is benefiting once again from another tragedy, which is a tragedy of the Israeli aggression on Lebanon and the refugees fleeing from Israeli violence. The Syrian regime and Bashar al-Assad is going to benefit from this tragedy unless we try to reframe what the Syrian regime really is and how unlawful it is to ever engage and to ever provide aid and assistance, whether it is political, whether it is financial, whether it is through diplomatic means, to this regime as long as it continues in this kind of way. Now, very funnily, when it comes to examples of resettlement or policies that have been going well, Italy has actually been having humanitarian corridors since 2016 from Lebanon, in which the numbers are very small. I think there have been around 8,000 Syrian refugees being transferred from Lebanon to Italy through humanitarian corridors in the past years. It is done through religious channels, through the church, through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Italy. But that is an example of a practice that it is useful. Syrians are not forced to take the boat in this kind of sense. They're coming to Italy through humanitarian corridors, but there have been obviously better even examples of Germany or Netherlands or France in the past, but unfortunately, like Nadine has mentioned, there is now a shift toward far right, and we're noticing changes in discussion about refugees return in Netherlands, when we know that there is going to be elections in Germany, and in the discourse as well on refugees in Germany, despite the great work that they've done on refugees until now, it is also quite concerning. So I think that, and I'm sorry for bringing this very pessimistic outlook, but when I see Ursula von der Leyen, Meloni, and all those politicians signing deals with the dictator in Tunisia, with al-Sisi, I'm not seeing them that much far away from thinking in their own policy about doing the same with Assad. And that is where we need to work on in the coming period.
Thank you, Veronica, for that. And thank you for finding examples of positive policies, even in the midst of a very negative outlook. It is important for us as we think of policy solutions, because at the end of the day, people's lives are at stake. Hayed, I want to come to you with two questions that I'm going to combine based on your expertise and your previous writing. The first is, how are international aid groups responding to the influx of Syrian refugees returning back to Syria? Are they able to reach all Syria, all refugees? Is there enough funding? What are the types of obstacles that they face? Feel free, if you like, to also weigh in on how the Syrian regime plays into that. And then secondarily, if you want to add anything about the economic situation in Syria, whether in government-held Syria or opposition-held territories, this would be the time to do so. What are the economic realities that refugees are returning to?
Thank you. When it comes to access, I think it's fair to say that access to Northwest Syria and Northeast Syria is way easier for humanitarian organizations because they don't seem to face the same level of restrictions uh, from de facto authorities there. And there is more cooperation from de facto authorities with those agencies. However, there are issues related to funding that we will talk about in a second. When it comes to access and regime controlled areas, I think one of the major problem that I've written about and I've noticed myself as well as many others is access, because the regime has been able to weaponize access in order to manipulate aid as well as early recovery activities in Syria and in regime controlled areas in particular. And for those who are not aware of how those basically aid mechanisms or basically work, the routine and procedures in regime controlled areas basically are done, the regime forces or obligates all NGOs and UN agencies to submit their proposals for it to be for them to be approved by the government, and then those that are approved will be implemented. Those are not approved, which are many usually, then they cannot implement them. Then the regime would usually tell them to go and focus on other areas, or even if funding is not relocated to other areas, the main point here is that the people in those areas will not benefit from those activities. So it's still a tool that is basically, although it's supposed to be normal procedures that are sort of routine and easy to process, the regime has weaponized them. So at the end, what you see is, again, some areas are benefiting more than other areas because of that. And the other access related issue is related to security approvals. So you have the sort of project approval first and then security approvals later. And the issues related to security approvals not only impact where projects are implemented, but also impact the ability of those organizations to go assess needs in those areas independently and directly, as well as be able to monitor and evaluate the projects implemented there. And I think one of the major issues is that many of them are relying on regime partners and networks that then they are just supporting reports and they don't have direct means to go and verify those details, which is quite worrying. Now, when it comes to aid in general, as I mentioned earlier, it's decreasing year after year. And now what we have seen at the very beginning is that there was some emergency funding from the EU and a few other donors who provided that just to facilitate early sort of like early activities in that aspect and emergency activities in that aspect. Now, because the flow of refugees has decreased, as in flow of refugees from Lebanon to Syria has decreased over the past weeks, then that flow of funding has also slowed down. So I think now we have been reading reports that more Lebanese are going back because of the situation in Syria and lack of services and lack of aid. So I think we will continue to see more decrease in the funding provided or allocated to refugees in Syria. And when it comes to the economic situation, I think, as I mentioned earlier, those who cannot work, and the number of those is quite high. For example, in West Syria, I think 80 to 90% of the people who live there, they rely on aid support provided by humanitarian organizations. So now the majority of those people cannot access aid because of lack of funding. So what we are seeing here is that decreased aid, increased prices, and lack of job opportunities. So people are basically forced to I don't know, borrow money, try to cut on meals, just feed their kids, and then sleep hungry, and all of those sort of negative coping mechanisms that are not sustainable and will only make the situation worse. In sense, and in a matter of basically sort of future prospects, what that means is that people are not able to see any hope in staying in Syria, and the situation will continue to get worse. And that I think we will continue to have those discussions later as well, unfortunately, because the flow of refugees from Syria will most likely continue because of those dire economic situations. The same situation applies to regime controlled areas as well as northwest Syria, because as I said, low salaries, high cost of living, and the gap goes like some salaries are not even enough to basically pay rent and just provide food for 1 or 2 days. So the ability of them to provide for their families for the rest of the month is still a mystery that I think many people are not able to figure out how they're able to do it. But again, because there are many negative coping mechanisms, I think they're finding a way or another, but it's definitely not sustainable. And yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Hayat. That's incredibly helpful. I want to turn to 2 questions that I'll direct to Veronica, and Nadine, I'll invite you to hop in after. The first is, and this stems from where Hayat's going, one of the things that we haven't discussed yet is, in addition to all of the political, security, and economic challenges that we've laid out, there's also a situation of HLP violations, housing, land, and property rights. People, in some cases, don't even have homes to go to, whether those homes have been destroyed or whether they've been taken by others. Veronica, can you tell us a little bit more about HLP rights and violations that Syrian returnees face, or even what the reality is for those looking to return to their homes? And then primarily Nadine, but both feel free to weigh in. We talked a bit about how many of the returnees are women and children. What's the experience for women and children, particularly whether as they return or when they live in Syria? What is it like traveling without male companions? What are some of the things you've heard from partners on the ground? Veronica, let's start with you.
Thank you so much. I will focus on my answer on the HLP rights and leave the women and children to Nadine. The violations of housing and land and property rights is one of those issues that I mentioned earlier as one of those non-violent means of political persecution that the Syrian regime has utilized against the Syrian population in the past years. We need to be aware that housing and land and property rights have been a tool by the Syrian regime to conduct what it is called a demographic re-engineering of what it is Assad-held Syria at the moment, whether it is through seizing properties following the sentences by counter-terrorist courts or within the issue of detention crimes, or also by seizing properties following forced displacement, where many different militias or many different other actors have seized properties from people who have fled from their areas of origin, or by even enacting laws such as law number 10, which pretty much deprives people of their right to property by putting together procedures for claiming properties that are inaccessible and ineffective for most of the Syrian population. So when Syrian returnees try to go back to their country at the moment, first of all, if they're coming from areas which they fled because of the military campaign, military repression, and crimes against humanity of the Syrian regime, such as maybe Dareya or Eastern Ghouta or Zabadani or we know any of those areas, really, they find themselves in a situation in which their properties have most likely been destroyed. In contests in which their properties must have been seized by a specific actor or specific militia, which was the case of this individual who has been killed by Hezbollah when he tried to reclaim back his properties once he came back to his area of origin. Or even unable to reclaim back their properties because the systems or the procedures put in place by the Syrian regime through specific laws basically deprive them of any sort of remedy or any sort of accessible right to claim back their properties. So Syrians actually most of Syrian returnees do not really have the ability to go back to their areas of return, and that is why the concept of safe zone is so incorrect from any point of international law, because the right of return of individuals, of Syrian refugees, is the right to return to your area of origin, under safety and dignity and guarantees. So for European countries, as I mentioned before, to argue that people can go back to safe zones in the middle of nowhere or in areas that have nothing to do with their own properties, to their own life before their displacement, doesn't make sense in any way from any point of international law. So refugees return to contexts in which, as I say, they have no ability to claim back their properties. Their properties have been seized. Most likely, their properties have been seized by actors affiliated with the Syrian regime and face even further risk of violence and danger. But there is also the concept of the fact that those people who have left those areas, if they've left from Eastern Ghouta or they've fled from other areas, they are perceived by the Syrian regime as coming from areas that were the center of the position of the Syrian revolution. So they have, first of all, a risk of possible political persecution, specifically from the areas they go. And it's obviously the risk and the impact on claiming back your properties is exacerbated if you're a woman in the Syrian context because of the patriarchal and discriminatory policies that apply to property ownership and the ability to claim properties when it comes to women. But I will pass it to Nadine to go on the issue specifically of women and children.
Thank you, Veronica. And yes, Nadine, if you could just do like a short intervention so that we can also prepare to wrap up.
Definitely. So again, this is another situation where our numbers are not necessarily accurate. The reason why we're seeing mostly Syrian women and children crossing through the official crossings is because many Syrian men have either defected or evaded military conscription. So it's much more risky for them to be crossing through the official crossings, and so they're more likely to take irregular routes or risk staying in Lebanon. And with the experiences of women and children, one of the persons documented as having been arrested upon return to Syria is a woman, as documented by SNHR. And although we don't have a strong idea of generally the experiences right now of women and children returning, past reports from different human rights organizations such as Amnesty International showed that actually women do face a lot of harassment upon return, including by Syrian soldiers, because they're seen as having betrayed the country by having left in the first place. So we've heard of cases where women have been subjected to sexual abuse in front of their children as they're going through different checkpoints and re-entering Syria. So it can be, I mean, maybe this is not, a very widespread situation, but even one case is horrific enough. So it's not an easy situation as well for women who are returning.
Thank you, Nadine. And I imagine, of course, the economic factors that Hayat mentioned earlier often disproportionately affect women, particularly if they're with their children and on their own. To wrap up, I want to give each of the speakers 30 seconds to a minute just to make closing remarks, and in doing so, really hone in by sharing with the audience a specific policy recommendation you have on this issue, whether it's for the international community or at large, or a specific player in the international community that you'd like to pick. And we'll start with Veronica, then we'll go to Nadine, and then we'll end with Hayat.
Thank you, May. So I may be boring because it must be the third time I bring up the order today, but I think that this order is not, the order of International Court of Justice is not something can be easily dismissed. It is actually an order that European countries last year were very happy and very quickly made statements welcoming the order and arguing how this order is so important for accountability in Syria and for finally holding the Syrian regime accountable. So the order, as I said, it gives us some lessons and gives us some specific policy recommendations about what the European countries should do. We should not forget that most of European countries are state parties to the Convention Against Torture. This case is about the failure of obligation under the Convention Against Torture by the Syrian regime, and states under the Convention Against Torture have obligations toward the countries like Syria when they fail those obligations in the first place. And those obligations are obligations to prosecute, obligation to prevent, obligation not to recognize an unlawful situation like the one of the Syrian of Syria and the Syrian regime held areas, and of the authority that the Syrian regime still have, but also the obligation not to render any aid or assistance in maintaining this unlawful situation. So my policy recommendation is a very basic one. It is that European countries, just as they have welcomed this order last year when it came to put certain kind of obligations on the Syrian regime and specific measures on the Syrian regime, should go back, reread the order, and understand that a finding of irreparable harm against Syrians actually also indicates specific obligation on these states as well. And so I would expect European countries to follow through.
Thank you. Nadine?
I would just quickly add to what Veronica just said, that also applying the law equally across the board against all actors. If the EU and the West in general had sanctioned and isolated the Israeli regime as they have with the Syrian regime and Russia, we wouldn't be in a situation right now where Lebanon is also not safe for refugees to be seeking refuge. So there just needs to be a return to international law as a whole and an equal application of the law. And and hopefully that will help ensure that rights are more respected.
Addressing those double standards. And last but not least, Hayat?
I think it's mostly that dealing with the refugee issue cannot be isolated from dealing with the Syrian conflict, because it's a symptom of the conflict. It's not a cause of the conflict. So for that to be sort of addressed, the EU will have to still respect its values and principles and continue to apply it despite the pressure they're facing from far-right movements within their borders. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Hayat. Thank you, Nadine. Thank you, Veronica, for a really important conversation. I'm glad we were able to get you all together to put this issue further on the map and amplify the work of Syrian civil society and others who've been doing this for so long. I want to thank the audience for your engagement and your really dynamic questions. And I want to thank the Time Up team that made this event possible. To our listeners, you'll know that Syria is a priority country for Time Up. It has been, it will continue to be. So I hope you follow along at our website, timeup.org, and keep up to date with this work, because we will continue programming on this critical issue in the months and years to come. Thank you for joining us, and good day.